Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for this Investor Alliance and NEI Investments webinar focused on British Columbia's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. My name is Paloma Munoz-Quick, and I'm the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. The Alliance is an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. The goal of the Investor Alliance, for those of you who may be less familiar with us, is to provide a platform for responsible investment that is grounded on respect for people's fundamental rights. And of course, that includes Indigenous people's rights. And we do this multiple ways. The first is promoting the investor responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. And really that work is all about helping investors integrate human rights standards and practices and criteria throughout the investment life cycle and across asset classes. The second way we do this is by using a human rights-based approach to supporting corporate engagements that are focused on promoting the uptake of human rights and business standards, human rights due diligence by companies. And so that is a fundamental area of our work is corporate engagements. And the third is standard setting. We recognize that investors really only have so much leverage to ensure companies and their portfolios respect human rights. And therefore, we help our membership to engage standard setting bodies, policymakers, and others to ensure that public policy legislation is sufficiently robust and in line with international human rights standards. So this webinar today really fits into that category where, we see really key developments in BC that are looking to ensure that all legislation relative to business activities and more broadly ensure respect for Indigenous people's rights. And so this is certainly of great interest to us here in the Investor Alliance. So in today's discussion, really our incredible speakers will be sharing the valuable work they've done to ensure that this happens, and also their global perspectives on what does this mean internationally for companies, for investors, and certainly for Indigenous peoples. Jamie Bonahan of NEI will be leading this discussion, and he'll also be introducing our speaker. Just logistics before handing it off to Jamie. The first is that everyone is on mute right now, but if you have questions, you have two options. One is you can type your questions into the chat box, and when we get to the Q&A, I will read them out. Or two, raise your hand and I will unmute you so you can ask your questions later on. Second is that we are recording this webinar, so it'll be available after this, after it's done. We'll be sending that out to everyone. And I think that is it. So with that, Jamie, over to you.
Thanks, Paloma, and thanks to Anita as well for organizing this. Very excited that we have this chance to learn more about Bill 41. So I'm just going to say a few very quick words, and then we can move on to our speakers. And so, starting off in terms of why at least we think this is important, I would say speaking as a Canadian, Bill 41 represents a critical step on the path to reconciliation, and frankly, it's kind of hard to imagine reconciliation really occurring without this kind of step. And so hopefully this is something that we see spread across, like outside of BC, but through Canada as well. And for those of you who may not be as familiar maybe with the term of reconciliation, it is about mending the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures in Canada, and at the heart of that is acknowledging and respecting Indigenous rights. So it's a national imperative that is shared by everyone in Canada. But from a pure investor perspective, this is also a good news story that we really need to be a success and ultimately replicated for the benefit of companies and their investors. And I think explaining the value of this development is maybe best illustrated by looking at what's happening in the absence of a Bill 41, particularly in the resource sector. And I think you can sum it up in one word, and that would be uncertainty. Development of large-scale resource development projects in BC specifically, and Canada more broadly, currently face some fairly uncertain prospects in the absence of consent-based relationships with local Indigenous communities. There are numerous examples of projects that have gone off the rails, and it is a real concern for resource companies and for investors in those companies. And it's not just a Canadian issue. I think a lot of people in the webinar today will be familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline project and what happened there. There's a textbook case of how wrong things can go in the absence of consent agreements. There is a great study, if you haven't seen it, from First Peoples Investment and Engagement Program titled Social Cost and Material Loss, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and they look at the various costs associated with all of the delays and protests and everything that happened with Dakota Access Pipeline, and the cost to Energy Transfer Partners, who were the main proponent of that project, and its other partners and owners, was they estimate to be about $7.5 billion. So it is not a small thing, this uncertainty. So, but before I hand it off, I would say I think we'd be wrong to focus on the risks and about how things can get shut down. For us, looking at implementing UNDRIP, it's really about opening the path to finding agreements. It's about removing uncertainty by ensuring that development is aligned with the principles of UNDRIP. And so this is, we believe, a very positive development, and one that's going to create opportunity where before there was uncertainty. And so I'm just going to leave it at that note in terms of just the opportunity in front of us to see the success of Bill 41. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. I'll introduce Joan later when she speaks, but I'll start with Merrill. And then at the end, I'll wrap it up and talk about some actions that investors can take to support the bill and ensure that it is a success. But first of all, I'll speak to our first speaker, so Merrill Alexander. So Merrill is an Indigenous lawyer practicing Indigenous resource law. He was a principal and co-leader of the First Nations Economic Development Group at Miller Tuturo and Co., a Vancouver law firm. He negotiates, drafts, and provides other legal support to impact and benefit agreement negotiations in all natural resource areas, including mining, pipelines, forestry, and green energy. He has extensive experience in negotiating government-to-government agreements in British Columbia and Yukon. He works with the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chiefs and the First Nations Leadership Council. Merrill has also done pro bono Indigenous, has worked as a pro bono Indigenous negotiator and diplomat in 2 different United Nations areas, one on the Convention on Biological Diversity and the other on World Intellectual Property Organization, where it's looking at protection of Indigenous knowledge and culture through intellectual property law. It's been doing that for over a decade. And as well, Merrill is a member and hereditary chief of the Kitasoo Hey First Nation on the Pacific Northwest coast of BC, also known as the Great Bear Rainforest. And with that, I'll hand it over to Merrill.
I think you're on mute, Merrill. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional territory that I'm speaking from, the Lekwungen and Wasanich territories here in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Given that we're pretty short on time and I want to leave as much room for questions, I'm just going to launch right into the presentation. So next slide. So I'm going to just start off by giving you some opening comments on sort of the context in which the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA, or the Declaration Act that we're calling it here, just the context of British Columbia, the context of how it's, of its role that it might have in sort of a reconstruction of the BC and Canadian and international economies, and then just sort of try and go into a very pointed conversation about how free, prior, informed consent is not a veto and how the Declaration Act spells that out. Then give you a quick overview of the Act through a framework slide. Then talk about how I see the Declaration Act, or at least some of my initial thinking on the way the Declaration Act may affect a lot of the resource negotiations that are going on throughout Canada. I'll maybe give a bit more context to that when we get to that slide. Then some general initial thoughts about how the Declaration may shift the economy, not just in British Columbia, but of course internationally. And then if I have still some time, I guess depending on how it is, then I'll just do a bit of sort of like future gazing. So with that said, let's launch in. So obviously, Indigenous legal orders or Indigenous law or Indigenous customary law is really the true source of affirmed Section 35. In Canada, Section 35 of the Constitution Act recognizes existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. So it's our law that is the true source of our affirmed rights, whether or not that's captured in the Canadian Constitution, the UN Declaration, or this new legislation, the Declaration, the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. But I think it's important to note that it's our law and jurisdiction that is the basis of those rights, not these affirmation tools such as the Constitution and UNDRIP. They're not the origin. To put it a little bit in context, like obviously UNDRIP is just still like sort of at its early teenage life of being merely a mere 13 years old. In Canada, there's a really substantive body of law that's been interpreting what are the Crown's obligations around duty to consult, and that body of law is only about 26 years old. Whereas the consent-based wisdom, experience, and history that's captured in Indigenous legal orders, that's existed since time immemorial. So that contrast of a legal jurisdiction that has been and governs these territories and has since time immemorial versus these instruments which are fairly sort of very much at their infancy. It's really very interesting, I think, in that context that the BC Declaration or BC's UNDRIP may be setting a table for a new era of mutual consent, because really a lot of the conversation in Canada and in British Columbia has focused primarily on the duty to consult, which of course includes consent, but is only at the very highest standard. So there could be a dramatic shift occurring in British Columbia, which may have repercussions throughout Canada and hopefully internationally. So one of the things I wanted to take a bit of a pause and sort of I'll pick it up throughout the presentation is that obviously the pandemic is creating a real opportunity. I think, you know, it is in its tragedy, there is also opportunity, and a lot of the most present thinking right now is about how are we going to reconstruct economies locally, regionally, nationally, internationally. And I think one of the most, in some respects, I think this it's even more important now that strategic investment have an eye on sustainable development. And I think because there is such a necessity for an influx of investment in Indigenous economies, the impact may actually be much greater. And I think for strategic investors, I mean, governments obviously in every country are looking for partners. So I just think that we have a tremendous opportunity that exists right now to make the UN Declaration compliance as a material term for an investment in Indigenous territories, and I think that's going to can have dramatic impact on climate change and the future for all generations, including those of Indigenous children. So let's move on to the next slide. So one of immediately, like, good or bad for it, the topic that people always want to hone down on the UN Declaration is the issue of free, prior, informed consent. Like, 99% of the time that completely frustrates me because obviously the declaration is rich with content, and it dishonors the 25 years of negotiation to only focus on a few, like three or four provisions. But I do appreciate in this context that free, prior, informed consent is something that you either have to take head on. And it immediately makes me sort of think of something that the BC Regional Chief of the Assembly First Nations, who I advised in the co-drafting of the Declaration Act, said when the legislation was introduced in the BC legislature, and he said that when the sky's clearing for a brighter future in the Indigenous Crown Partnership, it's the wrong time to say the sky is falling. And I think there's been a real one of the initial responses, especially from industry on the legislation, was to immediately start focusing on the economic Armageddon that would be brought to bear in British Columbia if Indigenous peoples if their right to free, prior, informed consent became law. The sky hasn't fallen here in British Columbia, and if anything, actually, there's probably a really substantive basis of circumstances where consent already is successfully delivering projects in British Columbia, and that's been much more of a business norm. The shift here is really much more of an actual true legal norm that's more enforceable for First Nations that are sort of exist on varied scales of empowerment. If we can go into that later, if anybody wants to pick up on that. I mean, I think just any time that you base an entire argument around, like, if this happens, there's going to be an economic black hole, then there's really not a lot of wisdom to that. And that was actually I think one of the real important points to make here is that consent and veto are polar opposites of each other. Like, consent's about agreement. It's about a process of achieving and maintaining agreements. It's about sharing and respecting both Indigenous laws, Crown, as equals and as constitutional partners. Like, veto is also about unilateral action. It's about paramountcy. It's about overriding others and overruling jurisdiction. In Canada, the consent is really much more the trend of court cases. And in my opinion, it's the future. And most simply, it's about coming together as governments. So that's like really part of that bold step, I think, that's occurring in British Columbia, is that hopefully we are starting to put the past where where properly should be. Next slide, please. So let's give you a bit of an idea of like what the general framework of the legislation is. First sort of pivot point is that the Declaration Act in British Columbia was based initially on just upgrading a federal attempt at trying to pass UNDRIP implementation legislation, which failed early last year when the House of Commons passed it, but then the Senate did not pass it. So we use that as the initial basis, and so to some extent, the framework or the sort of the shell of where our starting point would be was already sort of set for us in British Columbia. So to give you some ideas of like core components of the legislation, one of the most important parts is that the statute says that UNDRIP is applicable to all the laws of British Columbia. I'm sure this is the case probably in many jurisdictions, but that completely kills an argument that's been very present in British Columbia and Canada that UNDRIP is merely aspirational. Now BC legislation says that UNDRIP is applicable to the laws of BC, and that is a dramatic affirmation. Like the potential for just even that section alone to be interpreted and create like a body of change is amazing. So I mean, it's as part of that, there's some operational elements to it. There's a commitment in the legislation to make all BC law consistent with UNDRIP. There is a section that enables the BC government to enter into consent-based government-to-government agreements. Prior to that, there was sort of like there was a ceiling on the sort of level of participatory decision making that could occur between Indigenous people and the government. And at the end of the day, the Crown had paramountcy. Now in the legislation, there's a possibility of there being consent-based agreement, and that is really about co-jurisdiction. So in some ways, that's actually like a hidden, or like a not like highly focused on aspect of the legislation, but that could also be a dramatic, empowering section for individual nations that are currently negotiating with the province. In terms of other operational elements, there's a requirement to develop an action plan with BC and BC First Nations or other Indigenous peoples. So the Crown and the First Nations Leadership Council are going to sit down and determine in an incremental way what can be achieved on a year-by-year basis. And then the accountability component is the next aspect, which is every single year in the legislature, the minister is required to report on the progress of implementing the legislation or the lack thereof. And Indigenous people will have the ability to be heard in the legislature on that. So there's a lot of the actual core content of sort of what's going to happen on an annual basis will be set out in the action plan and then reported on each year. So one of the other like really big issues, this might be a bit more sort of Canadian specific, probably not, but is a debate about whether or not who is the proper right holder. And the legislation really focuses on Indigenous peoples and focuses on a section within UNDRIP that empowers and entitles Indigenous peoples to choose organizations of their own. So there's there's a recurring debate about whether or not Indian bands that are created under an Indian Act in Canada are the appropriate decision maker, or if it's the nation based on its own law. And so this hopefully will be part of sort of settling that issue. So I mean, it's a shift away, I think, from state-based law to Indigenous law. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I'm almost immediately, just because in some respects because of what I do my day-to-day, is the immediate sort of question of what is the Declaration Act going to have on the effect of sort of resource negotiations in British Columbia, and how is that going to shift the type of projects that are in Indigenous territories? So as I was sort of alluding to before, there was initially, and still probably is in the background, a lot of fear of the dark magic of consent and how legal reform is going to happen just immediately. And, just that fear that there's going to be an economic Armageddon brought by this legislation. There was a lot of very national dialogue about that in newspapers when the legislation was passed, not just provincially, but nationally. I mean, we anticipated that as in the co-drafting exercise, and instead of having something that was going to be instantaneous, we use these mechanisms like the action plan to develop an incremental, thoughtful mechanisms for how we are going to implement the legislation step by step. So the action plan is one of the first elements of that, and that's going to be determining what areas of legislation are earmarked for prioritization for legal reform. That process was starting early this year, and in some respects, it's sort of been put on a bit of a hiatus. We're still doing work behind the scenes in the Indigenous side, but it's the idea would be to identify a number of key pieces of legislation that need reform. Mining legislation, forestry legislation, education legislation have been topics that, in child and welfare legislation, have been identified as some of the topics that I've heard discussed quite often. In terms of an implementation ask, I think one of the most important things I think to happen in the interim before there is a lot of legal reform is that we need to sort of develop a principle that requires that all project approvals should be subject to the government's free prior informed consent being achieved and the proponent through an IBA achieving free prior informed consent. In my mind, that would be a dramatic shift. That would empower Indigenous peoples to be able to give their consent or not give their consent, and then would also just make that an actual legal requirement, whereas that's much more of a best practice in British Columbia, not a legal requirement. So I think that would be one of the when it's an implementation ask that we might see advocated here. sorry, we just changed slides. Back up, yeah. Sorry. One of the consent-based section of the legislation is really supposed to be between consent-based between on a government-to-government basis. But what we've sort of seen in terms of implementing the duty to consult is that often consent is delegated to proponents. So I think there's a very high likelihood that if there are consent-based agreements achieved between the Crown and Indigenous people, that could be delegated down to proponents. So I think that's a fairly realistic implementation outcome. I think like one of the sort of the other elements is that I think we are hopefully going to see a real leveling of the playing field, because really what happens like in communities is that only the communities that have the most substantive economic and legal levers achieve consent. And those that are more disempowered, have less capacity, have the inability sort of to make legal challenges, they often do not, they're sort of like more in the have-not category. So hopefully there's a real dramatic leveling of the playing field that occurs. That will hopefully be like a long-term effect of the Declaration Act. Because right now there is like a real wide range in British Columbia of like how empowered or disempowered some groups are when a major project hits the territory or is proposed for their territory. I think one of the last points there, which is that hopefully there's going to be also a much more substantive focus on the role of Indigenous legal orders in impact benefit agreements, also in their application to environmental assessments. Next slide. Obviously, like there's a real hope, I think, that the declaration is going to dramatically shift the economy. And in some respects, this slide actually was much more like theory before. But I think now, in the current context, I think that because Jamie sort of touched on it before, but the ability for Indigenous people, especially in Canada, to bring dramatic legal uncertainty to a project through the courts and through other mechanisms is very real in British Columbia. So the issue of economic certainty and legal certainty is even, I think, even more important now than it would normally be. So, at this time when all governments are taking a look at how are we going to reconstruct the economies, I think this is a epic opportunity for us to reform our economies for future generations. Like I think the focus on sustainable development and the ability for that to be heard is like we have an opportunity of generations, maybe the greatest opportunity ever. So I think the inclusion of targeted investment in Indigenous economies really may allow there to be much more sustainable economic future for BC, Canada, and internationally. Ways in which that this legislation may sort of act in sort of stimulating that is that one of the priorities of the action plan could be to focus on financial services, which would be a highly strategic target for legal forum to make all of our financial services legislation consistent with the Declaration Act. Then touching on sort of like, I think like changing lending criteria to deem FPIC as compliance as a material criteria. Then I think there's strategic investors will have the capacity to also determine whether or not they want to lend to governments and lend to proponents and to make FPIC like one of the material elements of whether they decide to lend to governments or to proponents. I think that the empowered investing that can happen in this context is extraordinary. In the long term, I think, and maybe even part of that legal reform, there could be a certificate of declaration compliance that could be developed here in British Columbia or nationally. I think at the end of the day, I really shifting ESG like investment criteria to take a close look at when an FPIC of Indigenous peoples is achieved. It should be a really dramatic screening driver for evaluation. And how's my time? Next slide. Okay, next slide. So I guess, like what is, I guess the bigger sort of like long-term thinking is like, what's the future of free prior informed consent here? I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary opportunity in British Columbia. Like I think that the commitment to legal reform that's before BC First Nations and the Crown is unprecedented in Western economies. I mean, I don't think there's ever been an international and provincial commitment or committed in Canada to make such dramatic change, to take a look at all of the statutes of British Columbia and determine whether or not they are consistent with the Declaration. And that is what the Act requires. We're looking at some interesting interpretation guide tools to sort of try and start that work right now. But I mean, it's an epic commitment in terms of a legal reform perspective. Like one thing that you can say for sure is Indigenous peoples will be relentless in their advocacy, and I see that already in this pandemic and before, that there is the commitment of Indigenous people to see change, to see equity, to see their human rights complied with. That will be relentless, and that will be something that will be passed on from generation to generation. That will be part of, maybe always has been part of our DNA. I mean, I think, to give you some realism, I think because there's actually been like a body of law that actually has triggered a lot of sort of consent-based negotiations already in the British Columbia context. So there is a lot of positive examples where you could look at some particular major projects where consent was achieved and look at the context for that. But I think to say that there is a basis for proponents and the Crown that already is part of the sort of the legal DNA of British Columbia. So that, I mean, I think that there already is good business norms in some industries in British Columbia, and now it's a matter of taking that and making that law and making sure that that happens every time, not just when an Indigenous group has very powerful leverage tools or has the financial capacity to take something to court. So I mean, it's a really unique time. Like, I think we're walking a very fine line of being like, we're naturally, I mean, we have the history of being skeptical because lots of promises have been broken. But I think there is also a time of great hope. And I think there's a lot of people that are inspired by the possibilities of this act. And I think we're really hoping that the sky is actually finally clearing, which of course is become an even more useful metaphor when you think about the climate change effects that we've seen with the pandemic and the cleaning of the air across internationally. So with that said, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Merrill. As always, illuminating. And actually, I want to take a brief moment right now. Just remind people about questions. Please do type them in as they come along. We'll answer those at the end. I think we're going to have lots of time to get to those. And as well, just want to take a moment to thank Alan Young and Kevin Scott, who brought Merrill to our attention and also gave us some insight into the opportunities to support this fantastic bill. So now I'm going to introduce Joan, and she's going to speak to the international importance of this development and give her perspective on and put this into context from someone who works on Indigenous issues deeply. So Joan is an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera in the Philippines. She's been working on Indigenous issues at the grassroots to international levels for more than 20 years, advancing the rights and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. She's worked with Indigenous organizations in the Philippines for more than 10 years and led the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact as its Secretary General from 2009 to 2016. She was an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2014 to 2016. She received the UN Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award from the UN Environment in September 2018, and she has been the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development from March 2017 to present. And so we are very lucky to have her speaking. Joan, take it away.
Hello? Hello?
Yep, sounds great.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, Let me first express our deepest acknowledgement to this very significant development in the recognition of the rights of indigenous people. So we express our full appreciation to Merrill, of course, his colleagues, and to the government of British Columbia for adopting the UN Declaration to be integrated into the laws of British Columbia. This is, I believe, an unprecedented act of political will by a local government or state level within a federal state. And this is the first, as far as I know, and it sets the right direction and a very positive signal to other local governments who are actually sympathetic or supportive of indigenous peoples. For example, we see this in the case of Malaysia or Indonesia or even India, where it's possible for some of the local governments to actually take this as a model to also advance the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples in their territory or in their jurisdiction. So that's really a very positive and strategic impact of this action by the British Columbia government. The second is that it exemplifies a growing commitment by those in power to adhere to their human rights obligations, particularly to victims of historical injustice. We know, for example, in the context of Canada about the colonialism, but that is not limited to Canada, but also to a lot of indigenous people's territories where are being colonized. And with this action of the British Columbia government that comes with an action plan in the form of legal reforms and also reconciliation process, for a lot of indigenous peoples across the world to see how this will take place, or where the action plan will be implemented, and how this could also give examples of good practice where other governments can also consider and adapt in relation to their engagement with indigenous peoples. So what's really looking worth, like, for example, the reconciliation process that has been undertaken earlier by the government of Canada has raised a lot of interest across the world in a way how states can finally reconcile with indigenous peoples in the history of injustice. So that's the second, and the third one is it's also an act of goodwill and upholding the distinctness and dignity of indigenous peoples. And I want to emphasize the issue of dignity, because this is really what the declaration is all about. It's upholding the dignity of indigenous peoples as equal to the rest of humanity. And the reason why the declaration was adopted struggled was because of the historic injustice and discrimination of indigenous peoples, and we were considered less human, and that even our resources or even the way we think are considered backward or not. So as indigenous, this is an attack to our dignity. This is an attack to who we are as distinct from the rest. So having this adopted as a law that will guide actions of governments will then finally come to terms that finally indigenous peoples are going to be treated with dignity and respect. And I think that's one important aspect of this kind of action. So on the, can you say the next slide, please? Yeah. Now I would like to focus on the implications on business operations with some points. First is that it sets an overall framework and minimum standard on a rights-based approach to engage and build cooperation and partnership with indigenous peoples. And I think this is the biggest contribution. What we need to look in, the UN Declaration sets a framework of positive engagement, collaboration, and partnership. It's a constructive way of finally reconciling with the past injustices committed against indigenous peoples, and it should not, the view about indigenous peoples as anti-development, those things, or the issue of free, prior, and informed consent as pitfalls should not be. I mean, we shouldn't be looking at it as a negative way, but rather that these are what we need now to move forward, because we need to address the conflicts brought about by the violations of the rights of indigenous peoples. So in this respect, like I mentioned a while ago, it also sets the parameters for non-discrimination and upholding the dignity of indigenous peoples once we engage with indigenous peoples based on the respect for our rights and our dignity as people. It also defines the specific duties of states to respect, recognize indigenous peoples, including by the private sector. Because part of the duties of the state, as mentioned in several articles of the UN Declaration, is for them to take measures in consultation or in collaboration with indigenous peoples on the legal recognition on the land rights of indigenous peoples, how indigenous peoples are going to be included in any development processes or in decision-making processes that affects indigenous peoples. So in other words, it's ensuring human rights due diligence in the conduct of business, but also going beyond just a human rights due diligence of a tick in the box. Because human rights due diligence is not about a tick in the box, but rather ensuring respect and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. And in this context, there is to ensure that our rights to our land, territories, and resources, our right to participate in decision making, our right to benefit sharing, and our right to be part of benefits are taken into account. Can we go to the next slide? Because I think please, the next slide. Okay. Now, just to mention the earlier discussion, I just want to reinforce that the issue of the free, prior, and informed consent, which is part again of the UN Declaration, which is not an issue of just a mere procedural matter, but it's actually how do we operationalize the respect and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples to our lands, territories, and resources, to self-determination, and to our cultural integrity. So it's about respecting us as for who we are and how we also want to engage or develop as a people. And that should not be scary, because our vision is not just our own interest. It's not a selfish interest. If we look at what's happened to the world now, why we're having this crisis is because we're allowing vested interest groups to dominate decision making based on their own interest and not on the welfare or also the aspirations of indigenous peoples. So I would like to say, for example, on this aspect, I mentioned in my presentation the promotion on the issue of the promotion on the vision perspective of indigenous peoples, and this is exactly the point of sustainability and reciprocity. and I would like to link this to the earlier presentation also on the climate change of why we're having this crisis in the first place, because indigenous peoples have never, in spite of all the efforts that we have done, we've never been part of conserving Mother Nature, of conserving environment. We've never been part of any decision resources are going to be used, which is part of our right to our lands and our right to decision making. So the declaration now sets that, puts us in the center of this kind of situation that has been created. And I think our perspectives, our vision, and our own contribution will benefit the world, and that should be the way forward, even in this crisis that we face. So just to end, that this is really, I mean, the action of the British Columbia, I hope, will be followed by other governments, and that it will reinforce further the commitment of states and also the business sector or the private sector to really now use this to come to terms and finally reconcile and build strong partnerships with indigenous peoples for the future of humanity. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you both so much for that, both rich presentations. Hopefully you can hear me. I've transferred to using a phone now. What I'll do is read out some of the questions that have been coming in via the chat. Briefly, I'm gonna merge a few together. We have quite a few. So one question here for really anyone, but especially Merrill and Jamie, is, do you know examples of Canadian companies that have actually publicly welcomed DRIPA? And also, and this I think would, particularly Merrill, but also I would say Joan, can you give a few examples where consent has been achieved on an extractive project? So that's a question around companies. Just to kind of bunch a few, I'm going to throw another one out there, which is, Merrill, would you be able to share any key resources or readings that really summarize what is specifically not captured by DRIPA? And a third one, and we'll stop here, is around, or for this round, do you anticipate issues arising in relation to Canada's obligation under bilateral investment treaties? In other words, what are the implications of this, of DRIPA on Canada's investment treaties?
Do you want to start? I can start just on the one about who has stepped up to talk about the legislation in BC. And I only have a couple of examples, and Merrill may know better. But the BC Chamber of Commerce, from what I understand, has said some fairly positive things about the bill, and so far has been raised to be seen, I guess, with push comes to shove, but so far has been positive about it, as well as I know Tech Resources, local diversified miner, has also been positive about the development of the legislation and supportive of it. Merrill, do you have other examples?
Yeah, I mean the BC Business Council, which is like pretty much like the main conduit for businesses that are like based, especially large scale multinational entities in British Columbia, of every single sector: forestry, mining, exploration, big hydro, all of those, like, and just generally all sorts of like secondary and tertiary economy, like economic participants. They all belong to the BC Business Council, and the BC Business Council unanimously supported the legislation. So I think that it is a signal of like a pretty dramatic shift or an acceptance on a level in British Columbia that like this is going to be the norm. I mean, they were part of the reason that occurred also was that there was substantial consultation with both business, unions, educational institutions that happened before the legislation was adopted. So they were brought into the tent, and so that chorus of supporters was actually very well, like, was very well orchestrated. And I mean, like you say, it's early days. So I mean, once the implementation tools really start getting developed, we'll see whether or not, like, where the friction points are. But as it presently stands, BC, like companies that are based in British Columbia are openly supportive of the legislation. They have their ideas about exactly how they want to see the legislation implemented. I think probably most importantly, they want they're hoping for the same treatment, which is somewhat ironic, really, because like Indigenous people are often left out of the economic conversation, but they want to be part of all the tools and then the legislative reform and the policy reform that's going to occur. So they're sort of staking out like what their role might be. And I think at this point, like, Indigenous peoples in British Columbia are accepting that they need to have a core role for this to be successful, and individual proponents in individual territories, they need to see implementation happen. So keeping them in the tent is an important element of it. So I mean, that's probably, I mean, there probably is you could probably go through the very long list of the BC Business Council participants, but I mean, that's a pretty substantial amount of support. A lot of those companies are operating nationally and internationally. So they are going to learn from the process that's occurring in British Columbia, and they're going to see whether or not it's pragmatic or whether or not it's adversarial. And at least it is our intent is at the BC First Nations Leadership Council for it to be a pragmatic exercise, and that it's important to keep industry and unions and academia in the same tent with governments, so that we have collective strength in the way this legislation is implemented. So there was a lot of questions there. Let me see. I'll have to look at the let me see here. I mean, in some way, like, you know, like, Paloma, or you'd highlighted, like, wondering, like, what's left out of the legislation. I mean, at this point, nothing is left out of the legislation, at least from a jurisdictional perspective. Like, the commitment is that all BC laws shall be made consistent with the UN Declaration. So, I mean, that means like all 6,000 something statutes that touch upon like an extremely wide bandwidth of areas could be potentially subject to legal reform to make them UNDRIP compliant. The limitation of that is that the legislation, for the most part, is limited by British Columbia's own jurisdiction. So it doesn't have initially extraterritorial application. Like the BC law would not apply to Alberta. That's easy to sort of, that sounds immediately limiting. But then there are projects that, like, say, like the Trans Mountain expansion, which are extraterritorial in nature and have two provinces involved. Like, so you know, it's not as simple as just being completely exclusive to British Columbia, but there is possibilities that it'll have indirect extraterritorial application, especially for projects that cross borders. The important element of this having sort of a legislative momentum to it, which hopefully will continue, because right now I think all governments are so focused on COVID, is that there already are a number of other territories and provinces that have committed to implement, to have UNDRIP legislation. Immediately, I think of, you know, there's another, the federal government had committed to have a federal UNDRIP implementation bill by the end of this calendar year. The Quebec government is considering it. Ontario has a opposition legislative proposal in its legislature. Nunavut has committed to it. Northwest Territories. So you can sort of see that because BC has set a model that hopefully will work constructively, that there's the momentum behind that being a legal reform initiative over the next like 2 to 5 years, and that in all of Canada having relatively similar legislation, hopefully with some harmonization on that, that you could actually sort of see that gaining momentum. And that's going to have effects, but we're just sort of at the infancy of that. Maybe I'll pause there unless you want to circle back to any particular questions.
Well, was there other question? Oh, I guess there was the question around examples in maybe BC or elsewhere of where consent's been achieved.
Well, so did you want me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just
Yeah.
wanted to flag that I was on mute, so I was talking. Yeah, since we only have about 4 minutes left, we may need to just kind of leave it to final comments. We have several other really great questions have come in, so I'd like to suggest that we share those questions with you after the webinar, and if you could kindly answer them in writing, we could then send them to the attendees of the webinar in writing. So final comments, and then over to you, Jamie, to wrap us up and really just kind of call everyone to act in support of this legislation. I will close off here. So thanks, everyone, and over to the panelists and Jamie to close.
Merrill, do you want to start?
Yeah, just to quickly respond, if there is any industry that has consent of Indigenous peoples. Hello?
Yes,
Yeah?
we can hear you. Yep.
Hello? Yeah,
Yes.
there is one that is recognized as a case of a mining company in Australia that got the consent of the affected communities, including a signed agreement for joint monitoring, benefit sharing. So I don't have the time to go to details, but there is at least one case that I know that happened. Now, just as a final word, I just want to again say that this very positive development that the government of British Columbia has done has really good implications, including on business operations across the world, as it sets a very good example and hopefully a good precedent of good practices that other governments can follow. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank everyone for giving us this opportunity to sort of highlight the legislation. I mean, I really do think that there is going to be immediate national and international implications of the legislation, just because money has no has no like country of origin that it sticks with. So I think the real opportunity for areas where UNDRIP compliance can be said is ultimately going to ensure that there's greater legal certainty. And I think investors are always looking for legal certainty. So I think the attraction and the possibilities of the legislation having broad effects are extraordinary and exponential. So with that, I think that I still remain hopeful that there'll be some dramatic change that'll occur in British Columbia and Canada. And I thank you for your time and attention today.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for taking the time to share this with us. It has been a fantastic webinar, and I'm going to close with just speaking about, as Merrill just mentioned, just the importance of this to investors, but more importantly, that we have an active role to play here, and that's showing some real support for this development will lead to its replication, both within Canada. As Merrill mentioned, there are federal and other provincial governments who are considering similar legislation, and so seeing this received well increases the chances of that happening in the near future, as well as internationally. This sets a precedent that we want to see replicated. And so There is an opportunity for investors to show that support through an investor statement of supports that we put together. For everyone who signed on to this webinar, you'll receive an email afterwards with a link to that you can sign up. If your organization is able to, we can open that up, and over the next couple of weeks try and find as many signatories as we can, and to share that with the government of BC to show that there is investor support for the leadership that it's shown in taking this on. And so, so look out for that shortly. And then otherwise, thanks again to Paloma and the IHR for hosting this, for Anita for doing the coordination, and to our speakers for their fantastic contributions, and for everyone attending. Thanks so much. To you, Paloma.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye.